Hi, welcome to our webinar on autism, the early signs and symptoms. I'm Swati Narayan.
I'm Gita Srikanth. Swati and I are BCBAs, and we are part of a resource center called WeCAN in Chennai, and we run a resource center for individuals with autism. Apart from providing diagnostic services, parent counseling, parent training. Training is really one big passion of ours, and yeah, we really love dissemination, information dissemination and dissemination of the science as well. So thank you for joining us.
And thank you, Autism Connect, for having us on this platform. So before we start, I'm sure everyone here knows what autism is, but a little bit of background. Currently, 1 in 59 births in the US are of children with ASD. Earlier, there were many disorders such as autistic disorder, CDD, PDD-NOS, and Asperger's syndrome, which are now all reclassified and are called autism. So what is autism?
So again, this is something we've all heard so much about and read so much about. Every child with autism is impacted in certain areas of development, social interaction and communication, and restricted or repetitive patterns of thought and behavior. It's a spectrum disorder, and so different children are impacted to differing degrees in each of these areas, but the impairments kind of remain common among all children diagnosed with autism.
So let's look at some differential diagnosis. Before we jump into how to identify autism, let's look at some differential diagnoses that may mimic autism but are not necessarily ASD. One of them is a speech language disorder. Children who get diagnosed with a speech or language delay compensate for that delay by using some nonverbal forms of communication, such as pointing, gesture, saying come, but they may not have the words, they may not have language, or they may have splintered language, but they're able to use their body in order to communicate effectively.
Then, of course, we have intellectual disability, where they may not meet the criteria for a diagnosis of autism. They usually do have appropriate social and communication virtues. I mean, a lot of them may not be vocalizing, but the intent to socialize, intent to communicate is still high in individuals with only intellectual disability.
And then there's a whole host of genetic conditions that I'm sure we're all familiar with. Some of the top 3 genetic conditions that come up very often are Fragile X syndrome, Angelman syndrome, and Rett syndrome. These syndromes tend to mimic autism, but there is a testable genetic component, which means if the family chooses to go for genetic testing, then they can single out what is causing this ASD-like syndrome and what it actually is. So these children do not have autism, though they seem to display autistic traits.
So this early diagnosis and how early is too early? How early is too early is always a contentious issue, right? Because we all know, like among most everything, right? Anything from a physical ailment to anything, early intervention. And the earlier you diagnose, the better the prognosis and so on and so forth. And that applies to a condition like autism as well. But the point always is that autism is kind of such a hidden disability, and sometimes when a child is only as young as 12 months, or 15 months, or 18 months, the signs are so subtle, and there is always room for development. One likes to think that, oh, let's wait till the child is 3, and it's too early to tell, and so on. So it's never too early, and when there is a doubt, and if there is a suspicion, if there is a feeling that something is not all right, it makes sense to actually have it checked out and ruled out. Though you may not be able to really get a diagnosis sometimes, but let's start being aware of it.
Did you know that the earliest you can get a gold standard evidence-based diagnosis is 12 months?
Wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's look at, I mean, we spoke about social and communicative behaviors, we spoke about repetitive interests. So let's look at some of the milestones of normal child development, which will help us understand, where deviations might start coming in for us. So month 1, the child looks and follows moving objects within a 45-degree range. He sometimes can quieten when he hears a voice. Of course, children cry to express themselves at this point, express displeasure. And when a caregiver talks to them, the child can actually look intently into their eyes at this point.
So that was month 1. Month 2, you're looking out to see if your toddler is following dangling objects. You typically have the toy mobile that goes around, and then you see if the child is actually tracking the movement of the toys. Visually searches for sound. So you step away from your toddler and you make a sound and you look to see if he's scanning, how much ever he can see in that lying down position, whether he's scanning to see where the sound is coming from. The toddler makes noises other than crying. He gurgles. His crying becomes very communicative. There is a distinct crying for when he's hungry or he's wet, and a very different crying when he's happy. He vocalizes to familiar faces. He knows who mom is, and there is a social responsive smile that emerges at 2 months.
Month 3, little more changes. There's squealing, there's cooing, there's little more, babbling and noises coming out, more recognition of faces, voices and objects. The child may spontaneously smile when he sees familiar people, or when he's engaging in play with them, and is also becoming a little more aware of things happening around him. Really.
Right, and then at month 4, the child enjoys being rocked, bounced, and swung as much as you would to a 4-month-old. And that's followed with month 5, where he watches objects that are dropped. So you drop something, the child actually tracks the movement of the object falling down. He starts to say things like or goo. He begins to smile at his mirror image. So essentially you take your toddler to a space with a little mirror, and then you look to see whether he recognizes himself, whether he smiles when he sees himself, or if he gets upset when he sees himself. The toddler begins to get upset. If you take away his preferred toy or blanket, he cries, and he can tell who's family and who's not family, and he begins to discover his own body at 5 months of age.
Yeah, you do begin to see some
movements. Yeah.
Month 6, the child begins to turn his head from side to side, up and down, and you might start hearing single syllables like man, ta, pa, sounds like that. Month 7 is when children start responding to their name.
That's a big, big milestone, right? Response to name call.
And also orient a lot when others are talking, and attempt to actually have a conversation back. Those obviously not words, but they can actually kind of imitate the intonation or a length of things. So you can actually have a back and forth conversation with them, with no words.
Okay, so month 8. Month 8 is when he starts to reach for toys that are out of his reach. He extends his arm. He propels forward for the toy. He begins to vocalize. Repetitive sounds like mama, amma, pa, dada start to come out. This is also the age, interestingly, when your toddler understands the meaning of no. So he understands reprimands, and he begins to dislike diaper change, baths. It begins to be a really tricky phase for mom.
Yeah, I know. Month 9. Face washing. A lot of kids actually don't like water on their face. So this is when the child is about 9 months of age, is when if the child dislikes face washing, he actually put out his hands in front of his face to prevent the caregiver from washing his face or water coming onto his face. This is a milestone to kind of keep in mind because it's critically children with autism display this particular response in a little different way. We will talk about it as we go further. And of course, the child also begins to realize that that his behavior is having some impact on others. So he begins to realize that whatever he can do certain things that maybe please his parents, and that certain things he does do not really need with approval from his parents. We can get a sense of largely what is right and not right at this point.
Object permanence begins to develop, month 10. Imitation, another critical, crucial skill, and we all know that toddlers with ASD have delays in imitation skills. Some don't develop it at all. So imitation skills come about in month 10, and you'll also notice that the toddler likes being read to. So if you have a picture book open and you're actually reading or looking at the pictures, he begins to follow your hand and look at the book with interest.
Month 11, rolling a ball when on instruction, or becoming excited when the task is mastered. Like, hey, look, I did this. Frustration when they're restricted. So here's where we sometimes work on in diagnostics, work on blocking play. And when we block play, we typically look for the response of the child. A typically developing child will display frustration if he is restricted or prevented from continuing with his play.
Month 12, your toddler begins to turn the pages in a book. He follows rapidly moving objects. He begins to vocalize 3 or more words, which are not mama, papa. So they're not repetitive words. Rather, they are more distinct, different words. He understands the meaning of several words. So his receptive communication begins to blossom, and he begins to imitate sounds. What's interesting is he also begins to cling to his parents in strange situations, and he also searches for objects where he last saw them.
18 to 24 months, a lot of interesting developments, and when the child actually has maybe 8 to 10 phrases that are decipherable largely. And he also looks at the person that he is having a conversation with. The child, of course, knows to say hi, bye, please, little things like that. He can ask for information, and even if there's not a lot of extensive language, children can start using pointing, communication gestures like, oh, I don't know where it is, I can't find it. Little gestures start developing. Then they also play with stuffed animals, beginnings of pretend play. They can actually treat those stuffed animals like they were real animals. There will be hugs, kisses, petting the stuffed toy, and so on. They also begin to learn, turn taking in playing with other children. So beginnings of socialization as well at this point, and beginnings of possession. This is my toy. Don't take it from me. And all of that starts developing.
So what's interesting in these milestones, if we can just take you back a little bit, is month 7, response to name call. This is something to really watch out for if your toddler is not responding to name call. And the other really important milestone is month 9.
Yeah.
When a typically developing toddler, when you're washing his face, will put his hands in front of his face to block you, or his arms, in whatever messy fashion that he can. Not very coordinated, but he will attempt to do this. Interestingly, research shows that infants and toddlers with ASD will not use their arms to block their face, but will instead move their face away from the person who is washing their face.
So you'll typically find them turning away like
this. Turning away like
that. Avoid that.
That's right, and not using their hands. The other important milestone is, of course, month 11. In diagnostics, we call it disabled toy play. When you block the child from playing with a toy that he enjoys playing with, very often the toddler with ASD might wait a little bit to see if you'll give it, and might just get up and go to some other toy that he likes, something else that he likes. Whereas a typically developing toddler will ask for it, will cry for it, will try to get your attention for it.
Yeah. So while we looked at milestones, we looked at months at which typically children develop some of these milestones. So having said that, there are averages. Not everybody develops this at 1 month, at 2 months, 3 months, and so on and so forth. And yes, children develop at different speeds, different skills at different speeds, and all children do that. So if there are delays, or if there are, significant differences in any of these things in isolation, then we surely don't want to jump the gun and start worrying about, is my child developing normally, or does he have a problem? But for the first suspicions of ASD, we are looking at any or all, or a combination of many different developmental milestones. So the first one of them is gaze. So interestingly, there are a lot of young toddlers with ASD who actually have gaze. I mean, they can look at you. They can really look at you.
Right.
So where we always think of children with ASD as being children who avoid eye contact and never actually look at a person in the face. But you do have some toddlers who will actually keep looking at you. The important thing with this is, it's not the gaze or not gaze, but is the gaze meshed with an intent to communicate? I mean, let's take an example. If the child is actually playing with something exciting, or you blow bubbles. Let's say you blow bubbles, and the child loves bubbles. So you may have a child who's enjoying himself, who's clapping, jumping up and down in excitement and laughing. If he's a neurotypical child, one of the things he's likely to do is also look at the caregiver while he's laughing, with a bit to share his enjoyment, and with a bit to communicate, hey, I'm having fun. You may have another toddler who has gaze, but when he's actually enjoying himself, he is having fun. Same situation. He's jumping up and down. He's excited, clapping his hands, but he is not gazing at the caregiver at that point of time to share his enjoyment. So this is where it's important to distinguish: is gaze there as a means of communication, as a means of sharing emotion, as a means of communicating something, and as a means of sharing. This actually even happens with, say, a child is scared of something, right? A loud noise or something scared him. A typically developing child will actually go running back to the caregiver and report,
Yeah.
even without words, report fear. But you may have a toddler with ASD who will just go running back to the parent, but will not give that look at that person and communicate that, hey, I got scared. So
Right.
it's a very subtle difference, but actually not so subtle, because you really look at your child and realize he's having fun, but hey, he's not sharing it with me after all.
The other thing that we look for is infant vocalization. Very often we have parents who report, yes, my infant, he vocalizes, he makes noises, he imitates what we're saying without the words, but with the intonations. But very often they realize that the vocalization is not in response to something that the caregiver has said or done. So very often you find infants with ASD who then become children with ASD who are singing a rhyme by themselves or humming a tune by themselves. In the case of infants, it's just babbling or cooing something, but it's by themselves. It's not in response to something that their caregiver has said. It's not in response to their caregiver saying something like, oh, coochie coo, and saying something to them. They're not responding to that. They're just doing it in isolation.
Yeah, but infants do vocalize even when they're playing by themselves. The critical thing is, do they also vocalize in response to interactions with the caregiver? That's
the crucial difference, right?
Is it happening across the board, or is it only when they're playing by themselves? Of course, caregiver recognition. I mean, this always takes me back to a friend of mine. Her son is a young adult now, a big strapping man. But I always remember she would talk about, when they got a diagnosis of ASD, he was about 2.5, I think. I don't know if she's on the listening to me. So they had to leave the child. The husband and wife had to leave the child for I think 3 or 4 days and travel somewhere. And her constant worry was like, when they came back at the end of those 3 or 4 days, would my child even recognize me? Would my child look up and smile at me? Because oftentimes caregivers feel like this child doesn't even care when I'm coming into the house. He doesn't care if I'm leaving the house. So does this child even, have any affection for me? Does he even realize that I'm mom or I'm dad, and so on and so forth?
We notice that it is very sporadic in infants, right? Also, another thing to note is that the infant does not make any initiations to gain the caregiver's attention. If they want something, they're not going to approach the caregiver and get their attention. They're not probably not going to make eye contact for it, or they're not going to orient towards them and cry for it. They're just going to do it in isolation.
This is again a very subtle thing, because when a child, I mean, when there is an infant in the house, it's usually the adults who are, spontaneously we go and interact with the children. We don't notice whether they're initiating it as much otherwise.
Yeah.
It's so innate in us. Like, we want to go and reach out, we talk to kids, we take care of them, we know every cry, we look at the time. We practically don't give all young kids a chance to initiate a lot of stuff, and so sometimes we miss this point, and we believe that the child is all right, not realizing that the caregiver is the one who's actually starting off all the conversations. There is very little effort from a child in initiating.
The other thing is, of course, not imitating sounds or movements. So very often you might see delayed imitations, or you do something today and he does it day after tomorrow, in just the same way that you did it. But on demand, he doesn't imitate sounds. He doesn't imitate movements. If you clap hands and look at him, he's in all probability not going to clap his hands as well, which a neurotypical toddler would do.
I don't know if you know, but we have a lot of every culture, I'm sure, has these little songs and these little action songs, really, which are passed on from generation to generation in every kind of language, where all mothers kind of do this while they're playing with their children. And if you really analyze those things that are handed down from generations, it is all kind of around imitation.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, imitation and language, and the child is watching. There'll be a lot of repetitive sounds in that, the sounds which are kind of fascinating for children, typically developing children. And in a way, it would almost seem like they're testing to see, does this child, is he going to start learning imitation?
That's interesting. Yeah.
There's odd posturing of body and hands sometimes. Again, it can be very subtle in infants. Things like stiffening of the body sometimes. We had an 18-month-old who all the time would have his index finger out, and so the parents said, "Yeah, he points. Of course, he points." But you when we watched him over a long period of time, we realized it's almost a default position that is his fingers were held in, and it was not with an intent to communicate or an intent to show us something. That was just the posturing of his fingers, which made it seem like he was actually pointing, while it was not. Just
the other thing, of course, is repetitive interest in playthings or objects. Very classically, an interest in wheels, anything that's spinning, a piece of thread, anything that's dangling, any movement that can be repeated over and over and over, and preferably one that the infant can, repeat himself and manipulate over and over, is something that we've seen in infants with ASD. There's also very limited social play. One of the things that you do with infants is peekaboo or tickle, I'm going to get you. And while they may cackle with excitement and joy when you tickle them, they fail to share that excitement with the caregiver. So it's a very subtle difference between a neurotypical infant and an infant with ASD, because both of them might laugh when you're tickling them, or might look happy when you're playing peekaboo. But the difference is the neurotypical will look at the person who is playing peekaboo with them or tickling them, or look at a caregiver in the room and say, hey, I'm having fun. Like, he will exchange that look. Whereas the infant with ASD will be laughing in isolation. He will not be referencing or sharing that joy with his caregiver.
Yeah. You know, talking of repetitive interests, I go back to that friend of mine, my reference for everything. She used to talk about how her infant could spend hours stacking cups. He would stack it, unstack it, stack it, unstack it. And I think it was like a sleight of the hand. I mean, he had become an expert at it by default. But at that point, before the diagnosis, she just thought, wow, I have such a great kid. He can just engage himself, through the day. Very happy child. But yeah, so repetitive interest in playing things for objects brought that back to my mind. Then, of course, we have the most important thing, which is joint attention or the 3-point gaze. We all do that, right? With typically children, look at the fan and look at the light, and of course, going further, look at the moon. Though we don't know what the children look at that point of time, or look at the bird that is sitting on the tree. And when we point to something, the child will automatically look in that direction and look back at us. So there's a 3-point gaze, right? Or if the child wants to, there's an object right in front of the child.
It's up for you, yeah.
So there is an object that looks interesting, and the child is going to look at that, look at the caregiver, and look back here. This is a 3-point gaze where he wants to ensure that both the caregiver and the child are looking at the same object.
So it's look at the object, look at the caregiver, and look back at the object, and also look to see if the caregiver is orienting or sharing his excitement or displeasure, whatever that they are looking at.
So it works both ways. When he wants to show you something, or when the caregiver shows something, is there that 3-point gaze, shifting between that object and the caregiver. That, because a 3-point gaze indicates intent to communicate and intent to share the excitement, or intent to share the emotion or the joy. And oftentimes that is critically missing. Just pointing is not it, with an intent.
So let's take you through a little bit of science and evidence-based tools here. Very often we find that there is a bit of confusion between diagnosis and screening, right? So screening is when all children are screened for developmental delays and disabilities during regular checkups. Essentially, a developmental pediatrician would do this at 9 months, 18 months, and 30 months. There is additional screening if your child has history of being born preterm or has a sibling with ASD or a developmental disorder, in which case there is an MCHAT that is used, which is the modified checklist for autism in toddlers. Now, this is just a screening tool to check if there is a developmental delay. This is in no means a diagnosis of any kind. Then we have diagnostic tools. Diagnostic tools are very clear-cut measures to assess the presence or absence of ASD in the child. So one of the most popular diagnostic tools is the ADOS-2, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and that is considered a gold standard tool which will confirm or rule out ASD. And then the other tools that are very popularly used are the ADIR and the CAS scale.
So what happens if the child is diagnosed with ASD, right? So we've all, this is a very textbook thing we've all read about, the transdisciplinary approach, multidisciplinary approach. It exists in many places, but there are many countries and situations and places where
we're still trying
to get there. But this is an ideal scenario where the parent when on the first suspicion goes to primary healthcare provider, and that may be a developmental pediatrician or a pediatrician, and they may actually, look at the child and recommend that they see a neurologist or a psychiatrist or whatever works in that country. They may be referred to a psychologist for certain evaluations, right? Running some of the diagnostic tools. Very often in some countries, psychologists run it. Assuming it's a diagnosis of autism, the most critical thing at that point is family counseling.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, most people have not even heard the word autism before, somebody told them, "Hey, your child has the autism spectrum disorder." Some people may have heard of it, but they really don't know what it is. So it's like actually delivering a life sentence, and you don't know what the heck it means, right? So counseling, family counseling, giving them information about the condition, giving them information about what the prognosis of the condition is likely to be, what does it imply for the child, what does it imply for the family, and so on and so on. There's a lot there. Obviously, the family has to go through the process of grief and denial, then finally reach a stage of acceptance, right? And so that's going to take some hand holding and support. This hand holding and support should also give them enough information about what they really should be doing next in terms of intervention. Because that is where very often parents actually have to shop around. Then they go into the World Wide Web, where there is so much of information that it can actually be pretty mind-boggling. So giving them curated websites or curated articles that they can read, which state facts and nothing more than that, and also in knowledge about what are the options for intervention, what are the evidence-based and scientific methods of intervention. ABA, or applied behavior analysis, as we all know, is one of the most well-researched and evidence-based forms of intervention, and one of the most successful evidence-based forms of intervention. The child may also need additional services like occupational therapy, speech pathology. So it really, really depends on that individual child, but a parent would need support from all of these service providers and professionals.
So we'll just take you through some of the evidence-based methods of treatment. This is purely educational. There is applied behavior analysis, which we all know, and there are a whole host of other services or other types of interventions. Some of them fall under ABA, some of them don't, but all of these have solid evidence behind them, which means there are rates of improvement, and you can most definitely use this if you have a child with ASD. Early start Denver model is another one such methodology. Flow time, visual supports,
PECS, functional communication training, where the focus is on actually developing communication skills. So, and it's all kind of covered under the gamut of ABA.
Yeah, and then of course there's occupational therapy and there is speech therapy. They all have their places in the development of the child. Here are a list of non-evidence-based services that are unfortunately around. Camel milk, stem cell therapy, the diet, some of these fall under the non-evidence-based. They are being used, but they don't have sufficient research backing them.
But who better to talk about intervention than Temple Grandin? A treatment method or an educational method that will work for one child may not work for another child. The one common denominator for all of the young children is that early intervention does work, and it seems to improve the prognosis. Isn't that so true? So many times we've had, it's hard, while it's heartening that parents on their own accord and sometimes feel that their child is actually having some problems, and bring in the child at 18 months and say, we have a feeling something is not quite right with the child. and why we do not push them for a diagnosis at that point, because it can be quite scary. Very often, one of the approaches say, oh, let's start working on some play and communication skills. Give it 6 months, and if the child kind of moves on and develops language and all that, and seems to develop, neurotypically, then let's just forget that you even came to us and let it be. But very often, parents actually they take that step, and sadly, they go away and don't come back. Obviously, like there's no denying that this is not something anybody wants to have to deal with. But yeah, the earlier you start, the better it is. And if more and more people, if there is a suspicion, if there is a doubt, then please go back to your pediatrician. And sometimes you may have to insist that they have to look for something, because very often I know doctors send them away saying, come back when the child is 3 years old, then we'll see. But if there is a doubt, there's no harm in starting some work, because like I said, you can always just drop it at some point of time, and the child is just going to blossom.
So ideally, how early would you say we'd have to get a diagnosis if there is suspicion? At what age can a family go in for a diagnosis?
13 months.
13 months. Okay, there you go. So we've answered the golden question. All right. Okay, so with this, we will be throwing open the floor for questions. So hit us up with any questions that you may have. I'm also going to leave a list of references, so you can look this up if you want to do some additional reading. And we have our contact on the screen. I think that sort of brings us to the close of this session. For the rest of you who have questions that we were not able to answer, please feel free to write into us and we will answer all your questions. Our email ID is on the screen behind, and it's wechallengeautism@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining in, and thank you, Autism Connect, for making this happen.